It's the week ending Saturday the 23rd of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped, sponsored by Barclays. In the past 7 days, we've seen children being separated from their parents at the US-Mexico border, a British politician causing controversy by preventing a ban on upskirting, and the Prime Minister of New Zealand giving birth to a baby girl. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team are Arion McNicoll, Kari Wilkin, and from the Week Junior, Felicity, Capon. And starting the show this week is Kari. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
I think this is the week we'll ask, are we slaves to the algorithm?
I think there's certain tasks that doctors just aren't as good at. So if you're looking under a microscope at breast cancer and there's one cancer cell, you have to look at 1,000 cells, say normal cancer, normal cancer. The human brain's not that good at that. The computer can do it all at once. So there are certain things it's going to take over and do really well. Other things will be in the purview of the physician. There still will be and always will be an art to medicine. The cool thing about AI, it's going to make the good doctors great.
Dr. David Ager speaking to CBS this morning. Kari, making good doctors great through artificial intelligence. What's the story?
So this week, Google's medical brain team reported that they've tested an artificial intelligence computer system that they've helped develop that can predict with 95% accuracy whether the patients would die within 24 hours of being admitted, compared to about 85% for traditional methods.
And that's basically just because of the amount of data being fed into the system?
Yeah, because it can analyse so much more data than humans could. It's looking at everything. And also what's crucial with this system is that it can actually use data that's usually out of reach for machines, such as doctors' notes on charts or on PDFs. I mean, it can scan something that would take humans days and weeks.
Yeah, Felicity, doesn't that actually just flag up, though, the issues that we have with medical notes, which is that some of them are handwritten, they're not all documented on one system together, and it relies on humans to interpret them. But there's no reason why you need Google to come along and solve that. You just need an efficient universal computer system, which we've had for the last 30 years.
Well, from my understanding of this story, I think the sheer levels of data that Google's using, I don't think it's beyond...
86 billion.
Yeah, I mean, that's beyond all sort of human ability to sort of process. So I think it's definitely not something humans can do.
If that's not just marketing bollocks, though. Because what they say is they're looking at things like traffic data and weather data on the day of hospital admission. But what if really the thing that's making the difference is just seeing whether or not someone had a knee operation 20 years ago, whether they were allergic to a steroid?
But then why isn't that working in the hospital assessments? Why is it so much more accurate?
Well, that's my question. Couldn't humans have solved this before computers came along?
I think this proves that Google and computers processing so much information can produce a far more accurate result. But I think there are so many dangers that come with that I don't think it's necessarily an inherently good thing.
Arion, channel your inner Eeyore. Talk us through those dangers.
Many things bad about this, but I think above all else, the problem with people handing over their medical data to the big tech companies, Google included, is that we just don't trust them. And I read a recent MIT research piece that found that only 8% of people are willing to give their health information to tech companies, whereas around 36% would be willing to give that same information to academic researchers. And pretty much everyone will give their medical information to doctors, not surprisingly. But I think that lack of trust is well earned on the part of the big tech companies because they've been losing our data and being hacked for the last decade or two. And, I think that people are right to be concerned about sharing their information, particularly with information that's as sensitive as this.
But Kari, maybe that's just a case of how you ask the question. If you said to people, right, when you check into A&E, a computer is going to analyse you and it's got a higher rate of accuracy than a doctor at seeing whether you'll die that day or not, might most people then say, OK, I don't like Google, but yes, go for it?
I'm not sure I would, because what if Google put my chances of survival at, say, 10%? So in that case, we're not going to spend our time on you. We're going to use those resources for someone else. And I think that's a major problem. You're effectively giving Google the choice of who lives or dies, in the sense it's telling doctors who should be treated how and prioritising. So, you go in, you've got a 50-50 chance of survival. That's not bad on the wider scale, but if that is lower than someone who's got a 70% of survival, your chances just drop to zero.
That was my thinking, and I think especially in the context of the NHS being under such massive strain and sort of at the point of collapse, I think it must be incredibly tempting if Google's saying, you get admitted to hospital and you've got a 2% chance of survival, you're automatically going to be bumped down in the sort of priority list, which I don't think people want that from. They want a human face. They want the care and treatment that everyone should get.
Well, hold on. Google aren't saying that, a computer is going to diagnose you face to face. They're creating a tool to help doctors.
Yeah, but it's the
You're not going to be terminated.
You're not going to be terminated, but presumably
you might be.
Sure, but someone will tell you, I'm really sorry, but your data suggests that unfortunately you're not going to make it through
But
tonight.
they're just the voice piece. I mean, on the other hand, this could save money because you are going to know how to better use your resources. So you could argue in that sense it's going to put more money back into the system to use for more efficient care. On the other hand, you can argue that it's not just about your chance of survival. Maybe someone comes in and goes, I've got good odds, but do you know what? I'm in pain. I've had enough. You could say that to a human doctor. Whereas, there might be someone, their odds aren't so great, but they really, really want to live and they're really going to fight. A human doctor can recognise that, a machine possibly not.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
Someone who actually is 95 years old and kind of wants
It's
to
just
die,
sort of like,
but their body might still have another 6 months in it.
But also, what happens if the technology gets it wrong? What happens if the algorithms get it wrong? I think there's this sort of implicit assumption that it's always going to be completely accurate. And there's this really great article I was reading over the weekend by James Bridle, and he's sort of listing all these examples of when algorithms have actually gone horribly wrong. So in 2013, Associated Press sent a tweet to its 2 million followers, breaking 2 explosions in the White House and Obama is injured. AP had been hacked by the Syrian Electronic Army, and its algorithms were sending out this totally erroneous tweet. Human journalists could rush to say, hang on, that's not correct, but the algorithms had absolutely no idea.
And I think that's a concern broadly. The more we have AI being applied to different facets of life, and you look at, say, the real legal tangle of questions that are bound up in semi-autonomous vehicles, for example, and those, if a semi-autonomous vehicle crashes, who is responsible? Presumably it is the company that takes some of the blame. And in this case, if Google misdiagnoses illness, and it's not just going to be being applied to something, as you'd think, fairly transparent as whether you're going to live or die in the next 24 hours. Presumably that's a starting point. And once you start looking at cancer and so on and those sorts of survival rates, what if Google misdiagnoses that?
I mean, it's literally a matter of life and death.
Yeah, but you're asking ethical questions that are coming out of data sets that don't exist. The data sets that exist that have been published in Nature that we're talking about now suggest that Google have a better rate of success than humans. So you're hypothesizing, well, what if they don't? But they do.
It's likely to cut down on human error. Humans interpreting data, especially these vast amounts of data, they're more likely to get it wrong. I'm very torn about this. I keep arguing for or against. But what does scare me actually is that Google are working to develop a voice recognition system for clinical notes that would eliminate the need for doctors to type them in. Again, you're going to eliminate human error, but again, more power to the AI. So it's whether you look at this on the sort of the more immediate scale of this can improve accuracy in diagnosis, that sort of thing, or on the wider scale, if we are handing more and more information to machines that we're teaching to think for themselves, that can debate against us, is the news story.
And I would add to that I think a lot of the time humans don't actually understand the technology they've created. And you've seen another example in this article was looking at, the famous match between Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue, or when Lee Sedol was playing the Chinese board game Go. And actually, when they were playing that game, the computer made a move that just seemed so random and bizarre that the humans just couldn't figure it out. And they sort of took from this, we can see what the computer's doing, but we have no idea the decisions that have gone on to get it to that place, which is quite scary, I think.
And I can predict as well that the next scandal involving this might be one of the computer being racist or in some way segregating groups, because you could easily imagine, couldn't you, there are certain medical conditions that, for example, I don't know, only affect people of Japanese origin, therefore they shouldn't get treatment.
Or prejudiced against age or weight problems that, statistically those people, that older people may have worse survival rates, and similarly...
It's like inadvertent racial cleansing.
Wow. Sure.
But do you know what I mean? It's only the fittest, the strongest will survive. You're almost getting into some weird ideologies there.
This is becoming a recurrent theme on this show. This is the third week running that we've blinkly referenced eugenics. But just to cheer it up as a final point, you've chosen this as your story of the week, Kari. Do you think this is a turning point? Do you think in 10 years' time the NHS in this country will be somewhat reliant on this technology?
I think this is already happening. I think it's just a matter of degrees of. We're already so reliant on AI for spotting, heart disease, eye disease, so many of these things. It's a matter of degrees, and I just think we're sliding there and barely noticing.
Felicity, you're up next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
A loosening of the rules and a loosening of order.
South Sudan's war started with a mass atrocity in the capital city, with government forces moving through the capital, targeting members of a smaller ethnic community. Members of that group fled to the UN base, an incredibly small space inside of the capital city. The war then expanded from the capital to almost every area of the country now, and we see homes, businesses, places of worship, hospitals, schools, everything being burnt and destroyed, looted. So people flee fearing their lives in the face of these atrocities, and even in places where there's potential for peace, there's nothing for people to come home to. Some of South Sudan's largest cities were completely destroyed, very little left standing. In some cities, the only thing standing now is a UN base, and civilians are sheltering inside of it while armed groups roam outside, threatening the lives of any civilians who cross their path.
That was Casey Copeland, a senior analyst for crisis groups, speaking this week on their website. Felicity, what do we mean when we talk about armed groups?
Well, I think this is a problem. I think it can refer to a wide range of any group of humans who have decided to take up weapons and use them. And I think that is the problem, is that it can be loosely applied to so many groups across the world. The reason that I brought this as my story, this was a report in the New York Times. It's the International Committee of the Red Cross who have done this research, that they are saying they're seeing far more armed groups on the rise globally. More non-state armed groups have emerged in the last 7 years than in the previous 70. So they're sort of saying across the world, more violence, more armed groups, and very difficult for humanitarian workers to know how to approach them or to make a positive difference anymore.
Arion, why do you think these armed groups are gaining strength, not just in South Sudan, as Felicity says, but in a number of places?
It's really very nation-specific. And in South Sudan, obviously, you've got a range of groups who have been embroiled in a civil war pretty much since South Sudan split from Sudan or gained its independence. Elsewhere in the world, you've got Yemen, which is in a state of complete flux. Libya, similarly, sort of various groups trying to take control and assert something that resembles a new government and a new order. Syria, as we know, is riven with conflicts, and the most recent estimates suggested that there are about 1,000 armed groups operating in Syria at the moment. So it is very particular to the place, but certainly from this New York Times article and that latest study that they highlight, it does seem that they're on the rise.
And Kari, the loosening of the rules of war, that comes hand in hand with armed groups, doesn't it?
Yeah, because obviously they're not going to be following the Geneva Convention, say, in the way that a government would be. So that makes it all the more hard to try to influence and persuade them to follow humanitarian law, because, you're having to employ culturally specific tactics and you're competing against a range of other influences. So it just adds a whole new level of complexity to, not just the number involved, but the variety of people involved in these sort of armed groups.
And also monitoring, I think, is a real problem, because groups like the UN trying to get in to determine what's happening on the ground and how to allocate resources to help people who are suffering from the violence. They can't even identify the power centers, let alone, once they have, communicate with them the way that they would with state-based armed groups and try to enforce things like the Geneva Convention, or at least explain how the Geneva Conventions work.
That's the thing. You may be dealing with people, they're not even aware it exists,
Right.
let alone following it.
Well, even if they were, presumably, Felicity, they'd question whether it applies to them. I mean, these are people who are in armed groups often because they themselves have been the victims of war, or they feel completely abandoned. There isn't a government, so there isn't actually a sort of local or state or countrywide law. So talking to them about international law is just basically irrelevant.
Yeah, that was the one thing I sort of struggled with in the article, actually. I sort of thought, well, even if there weren't a rise in armed groups, do armed groups that do have traditional power structures, are they actually heeding the Geneva Convention or the laws and rules of warfare anyway? So I thought that was slightly naive, possibly on the part of humanitarian workers, to think that they would be able to really
Perhaps
get in there
just
anyway.
A starting point.
Well, but case in point, the Russian occupation and eventual annexation of Crimea, where they sent in soldiers and then absolutely denied that there were even soldiers there. So, even state-based actors are no longer playing by the rules of warfare and probably, never have 100%. But I think it's at least there's a question of answerability, and maybe that's what's lacking in the case of non-state-based actors, because you just don't even know how the power structures work.
And there was also another report which is quite similar by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, who they say tens of thousands more people are dying in armed conflicts around the world, even though the number of actual conflicts themselves are falling. And that's partly to do with Western forces sort of very suddenly and rapidly withdrawing from places like Libya and Syria, and you're seeing all these armed groups sort of jostling around for power and control, which is quite interesting. And I think in Libya, with the uprising that toppled Gaddafi in 2011, you were left with 236 fighting groups, which is just madness.
So then the question then is, how much or to what extent is this our fault in the West that we're seeing this rise in armed groups? Because they often sort of fall down very predictable ethnic lines, don't they? We know those problems are there. We turn our back on the countries, and then, of course, they're going to try and kill each other.
I think, like Arion was saying, I think it's probably different for different countries. So I think you have very obvious examples like Libya. But then I was also thinking more broadly about things like climate change and the battle for dwindling resources. And are you going to see more armed groups and more violence in countries that you wouldn't have suspected that they would be, because we're all sort of fighting over a lack of resources? And I read somewhere, it was quite interesting, this idea that more conflicts and climate change leads to more displaced people and refugees, and obviously we see that in Europe, and we're seeing a big story in the US at the moment. And could this lead to ungovernable megacities where you have these huge sprawling populations, and they descend into lawlessness too, because there's just too many people concentrated in areas with a lack of resources?
And I think another factor is to do with the sort of splintering of people's identification with nation states in vast parts of the world. You have Spain falling to bits, not that that's necessarily resulting in the rise of armed groups immediately, but somewhere like South Sudan is, you are seeing the emergence of new states based on older versions of the way that people used to organize themselves. Similarly, across the Middle East, the way that the world was cut up post-World War I into countries had nothing really to do with the peoples who inhabited the area. So I think that's probably also triggering this emergence of smaller groups who identify along religious or ethnic lines rather than state-based lines, and which is where we're getting this new type of violence.
And again, I think that comes back into how much of this is our fault. We're very selective in terms of who we help. The Red Cross report said that a significant proportion of today's conflicts, I think about 40%, involve jihadi groups. And notably, the great majority of foreign interventions are directed against these jihadi groups, but, because that's something we actually want to fight. Whereas we're happy to leave. Happy to leave the rest.
Yeah. Arion, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
From now on, the end of June won't just be known for National Kissing Day, but a rather more significant commemoration.
Can she tell the House how many have been detained as prisoners in their own country? Can she tell the House how many have been denied health under the National Health Service? How many have denied pensions? How many have lost their job? This is a day of national shame, and it has come about because of a hostile environment policy that was begun under her Prime Minister. Let us call it as it is. If you lay down with dogs, you get fleas. And that is what has happened with this far-right rhetoric in this country. Can she apologise properly? Can she explain how quickly this team will act to ensure that the thousands of British men and women denied their rights in this country under her watch in the Home Office are satisfied?
That was David Lammy, MP, speaking in the Commons, memorably, back in April. That was after the news that hundreds of British citizens had been imprisoned, some even deported, for not being able to provide paperwork that was never given to them. Arion, what is the news this week?
Still gives me chills, that clip, by the way. It is just an amazing speech. But the news this week is that Theresa May has proposed that June 22, which is Friday this week, is going to be Windrush Day from now on. and it's specifically to celebrate that generation that arrived on the Empire Windrush in 1948.
Yes, a government spokesperson said National Windrush Day was to recognise and honour the enormous contribution of immigrants that came to Britain in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, and broadly, that moment and that generation are regarded as the real emergence, the emergent moment where Britain became a much more open and multicultural society, but also the people who came over on the Windrush and then in subsequent migrations contributed massively to really critical British institutions like the NHS, like British Rail, like the construction of the tube. You understand why Lammy was so upset and so agitated and so full of passion in that speech, because the scandal that has been exposed in the last couple of months that has probably led to the establishment of Windrush Day, it's so critical and important.
Bearing in mind that context, though, that we all know that probably, not that there shouldn't be a National Windrush Day, but probably there wouldn't be had there not been this massive cock-up in the government handling of it, is it a good idea?
I think that's the real question, and I'd be interested to know what you all think, but I think that the Windrush Foundation has been trying to get a national annual celebration for the Windrush generation for years. And would it have happened had we not had the expose that came about from The Guardian largely doing excellent reporting? Would we be in this moment? It does feel like Theresa May's trying to find a way to sort of compensate for the lack of other compensations that have so far been offered to the Windrush generation.
And Felicity, on that, is it an adequate compensation, do you think?
No. I think a cynic would say this is Theresa May and her government who messed it up and are now desperately trying to row back and find some sort of very tokenistic gesture. I think some people would say it's borderline insulting, really. I mean, you have all sorts of national days for all sorts of ridiculous things. And I mean, it depends what is done with that day, and it depends how much funding. I think there is some money that will come on this day to go to projects and community initiatives. And I think if the Windrush generation are in favour of it, that's a good thing. But I think you can't, it's never going to cover up the cracks of how absolutely atrocious and appalling the treatment that these people have been subjected to has been. And I think what would be more important, really, is that in some ways, the good thing about Windrush Day is the awareness that hopefully would come with it. I think more people would learn about the Windrush generation. And I must admit, I hadn't realised that the image of the Empire Windrush, the ship, was used as part of the 2012 Olympic Games opening ceremony, and I didn't even notice it. And I think if a day brings more awareness, that's only a good thing. But what about things like, incorporating it into the curriculum so that children actually learn who the Windrush generation were, and something a bit more substantial and something less gimmicky from the government?
That is one of the things that happens when you get national days, though. It does give you a peg, doesn't it, when you're a teacher at a school to say, well, today in history class we are going to talk about Windrush. It does give you that excuse. I know as a broadcaster on the radio to, punt out a question to the audience about that subject.
But national days are now so widespread that they've just it's almost become meaningless, that it's all just blurred into one long list of great awareness. I think you have to make the distinction between national days and awareness days. Awareness days can do so much good to raise awareness of important humanitarian, cultural and social and health issues.
Are you about to say that National Stilton Day isn't important? Because I quite like those
to Stilton
jolly
sellers,
ones
but
as well.
I think a lot of the national days have just become a marketing
Does
ploy,
anyone have the list?
And I think that's where it...
Can we hear some?
I've got a few.
Great, go for it.
Okay, so it does break down, as Kari says, into different types of national days. You've got those sort of product promotion days like National Fish and Chip Day, which is June 2.
Right, yeah.
National Cognac Day. Yeah, we've all missed these. National Cognac Day, June 4. National Gin Day, June 10. Cupcake Day is June 15. That's a big one.
Welcome after all that cognac and gin, I should imagine.
But then you get awareness days. We had Butterfly Education and Awareness Day on June the 3rd. World Environment Day on the 5th, and then you do get these kind of celebration or commemoration days like Armed Forces Day, which is June 24. So yes, this sort of fits into that last category, which is perhaps the most legitimate, depending on your feelings on Stilton, of course. But even so, it does seem that the celebration of that generation and their contribution is one thing, but actually making amends for the damage that has been done and continues to be done to the people. And the fund that's been established by Theresa May doesn't go to address that. There's still no hardship fund that's been established.
So on the current realpolitik of this, the reason the Windrush generation were vulnerable to that range, that tranche of government policies that Theresa May implemented when she was Home Secretary, was because the government wanted to be tougher on immigration generally, and an inadvertent error of the policy was that it affected the Windrush generation. So here they are saying, let's celebrate these immigrants from a particular time of history. Sorry, oops, we made a mistake. It's telling, isn't it, that it isn't a national day for immigrants generally, because
if they set up National Immigrant Day, that would be impressive, but don't see it happening really.
And those policies, I mean, this week you look at the blowing up in Trump's face of the zero tolerance policy on immigration that has, as you mentioned in the opening, had families being separated at the US-Mexico border. And it all sounds really good to your anti-immigration population until you start getting these real-world stories. And I think, Theresa May's policy also sounded like it was going to reduce immigration in a way that people wanted. But once you start hearing about people being thrown out and not getting cancer care and these people who have lived here for 50 years, it does seem
that's the thing. Windrush has put a human face on it, but then surely can we not learn from that and go, oh, okay, this isn't just about a National Windrush Day. This is about let's look at the whole immigration system. Surely that would be a meaningful response.
One of the reasons that we were talking in the mainstream media this week about the separation of children from their parents wasn't just the imagery, it was because it was International Refugee Day. And it flagged up that hypocrisy, didn't it? This is what Trump's government's doing at the same time we're supposedly celebrating International Refugee Day. That could be the use of Windrush Day moving forward.
Were people even aware it was International Refugee Day?
I saw Ben Elton talking about it on Lorraine. I'd say that's mainstream.
I do think that's true, and as long as the day gets used in the right way, then there's no reason not to have it. It's just that the circumstances that brought it around are pretty fishy, and it's too little too late for a lot of people who have been damaged by the scandal broadly.
Do you know what stunned me looking into all this? I mean, obviously this has been set up by the government, Windrush Day, but anyone can set up a national day. You just go to these websites, pay like a couple of £100 a year or whatever, and they will sort of basically market your national day, which is why it's so loads of companies and media outlets.
Olly Mann
you can
Day.
have a national anything.
How did you read my mind?
So again, it just maybe we need some sort of database so that it would actually be relevant rather than just having national stills and days, nothing against Stilton.
As long as they don't dilute and belittle the dates that actually really are important. So, I mean, things like Armistice Day, for example, I think people feel so strongly about that partly because you're losing generations all the time who did fight in the First World War and the Second World War, and there's that fear that you lose that link to history, and I think you need that day. I mean, I'm definitely not thinking about First World War soldiers every single day, but there is that one day of the year where I'm like, yeah, my freedom and my liberty has come through a massive sacrifice. And then if you put that next to National Kissing Day, you start to feel like,
that cheapens it a little bit.
Yeah, it cheapens it somehow.
Well, that is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. It is Olly Mann Day. Every day in my house. My thanks to Arion, McNicoll, Kari Wilkin and Felicity Capon. Now, next week, you can look forward to even more of us as we will be bringing you Business Unwrapped. It's a series of bonus shows brought to you by our friends at Barclays. I'll be joined by some of our regular panellists as well as some special guests to discuss some of the business and economic stories that have slipped under the radar. You will get all of those episodes delivered straight to your phone along with the normal show when you subscribe to The Week Unwrapped for free on your podcast app of choice. Until then, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.